When the transport truck rolled to stop at dawn, the world smelled of oil, wet earth, and a silence that felt like the inside of a lung holding its breath. A handful of Japanese women climbed down with their hands cuffed or bound, each step uncertain, each face folded into the same hard, practice calm that comes from being a small part of something very large and indifferent. Nurses, telephone operators, messengers. Some were uniformed. Some wore plain clothes that had been hurriedly pressed into service. None of them were soldiers in the way we picture soldiers. No heavy rifles, no medals. Yet every single one of them carried the weight of an entire nation's expectations on her shoulders. They had been told, for months and years before, stories that had grown as rumors do, that the enemy fought with savage intent, that captives were humiliated, that provisions would be withheld, that starvation was a weapon as cold and slow as winter, in their homes and barracks. The idea had been hammered in, layered over and over until it had the feel of scripture, an enemy who would not honor the rules the Japanese had been taught to expect in war. You will not be fed was not just a prediction. It was a moral certainty. So the first hours inside the POW compound felt like a kind of waiting for punishment. The compound smelled of coal fire and disinfectant. There were rows of bunks with thin mattresses, a low wall topped with barbed wire, and guards who spoke in clipped, unfamiliar phrases. The women were counted, registered, told to strip and hand over anything they had. The fear was not only fear of brutality. It was a quietly corrosive terror of not knowing whether the human body would be trusted enough to be fed. They were escorted to a large mess hall after the initial processing, a roofed rectangle of benches and long tables, with a hush of many hungry mouths. They filed in and sat according to instructions, shoulders tight, eyes scanning, trying to read the faces of the men who moved about the room. The American guards and volunteers carried trays, pots, and steaming kettles, performing their tasks with a calm that was not cruelty, but also not overly solicitous. There was an economy to their gestures, a professional efficiency. And then the food arrived. Imagine the scene in slow motion. A tray with a modest heap of mashed potatoes, a cup of steaming broth, and a slab of pale meat, pork, glazed and tender in a way that suggested proper cooking. Beside it, a roll of bread, warm enough to give off steam when cracked. For these women, bread and pork were not only food. They were signs of abundance, of respect, of a culture that still honored basic human needs even in wartime. A woman who had been a nurse, thin, with hands that stitched so many wounds they had started to look like their own small map of service, looked down at her plate and whispered to the woman beside her, "I thought Americans would starve us." The words were almost a prayer. They came from the crevice between fear and astonishment, and they hung in the air, both ridiculous and true. Around the table, eyes widened. Some covered their mouths with both hands, as if protecting the fragile knowledge that this kindness might be taken away at any moment. They ate. The first bites were tentative. Mouths tested flavors like spies test alliances. The bread flaked apart, warm and soft. The pork yielded easily and tasted faintly of herbs and domestic fat. No one pretended it was a feast. Yet every bite loosened something inside them. Later on, when they tried to put the feeling into words, they would speak of how the act of being provided for, that simple human reassurance, was like a light being turned on in a room they had resigned themselves to believe would always be dark. Short pause let the image settle. Part of the shock was practical. The contrast between the scarcity of home and the unexpected quality of the meal. But the deeper shock was moral and psychological. It forced a re-weighing, however small, of the narrative they had carried into captivity, that the enemy was monolithic cruelty. The presence of bread, properly baked, and pork, properly prepared, wrote a different sentence into their experience of the war, that the people around them could choose compassion even in the calculus of conflict. The days that followed were not one long, continuous easing into comfort. They were a series of tiny reframings, moments that shifted impressions just enough to make new questions possible. The women discovered that meals were regular. Not lavish, not abundant, but consistent. There was porridge or bread in the morning, a modest plate of meat or beans at midday, and a bowl of soup at night. The food was measured. Portions were controlled, but it was enough to keep bodies from wasting. Nurses among the prisoners noticed how wounds that might otherwise have festered showed signs of recovery. Weight stabilized. Sleep became bit by bit less jumpy. The daily rhythm allowed conversation to grow. At first, talk clustered around practicalities. Who had family back home? Who had last seen a certain town? Whether a letter might have come and been intercepted? Then, like a thread, winding out, stories of memories spill forth. Recipes, festivals, childhood games, the name of a village shrine. One of the women, a telephone operator in her mid-20s, described a morning in the countryside where she'd run past a stand of plum trees and tasted a raw plum stolen from a branch. The others laughed, a brittle sound at first, then freer. Yet doubt remained. The fear that had been taught into them was not something that vanished because of a single meal. It altered the way they spoke even when cheerful. Why are they doing this? Someone asked one evening, voice low. Is it for show? Another suggested a practical explanation. The Americans had rules, and international law required decent treatment of POWs. A few of the older women shook their heads. We cannot know the reason. We only know today. The answers were provisional, as if logic itself had to be tried on and tested against human behavior. There were other complexities. Not every guard smiled. Not every interaction was kind. Language barriers created small humiliations. A request for an extra blanket might be misheard. A question about a loved one might be answered with bureaucratic indifference. The women learned not to expect uniformity in human behavior. Kindness existed, but so did ordinary administrative distance. That distinction mattered. In the quiet of the night, constellations of memory returned, images of ration lines, of mothers waiting with empty bowls. The plate of bread in the mess hall felt, in those recollections, like a small rebellion against everything they were prepared to believe about the enemy. And yet there were moments when kindness seemed to be chosen, not merely mandated. A guard, older than most, sat with tea and listened to a woman describe the song her child used to hum. Once, someone smuggled an extra slice of fruit into a sick girl's bowl. A volunteer cook explained in broken phrases and gestures that the staff were trying to keep everyone healthy. They had their own rules and their own sense of decency. For the women watching, those gestures were not abstract. They were evidence that compassion could exist where fear had told them it could not. Crescendo slightly, then bring it down. The most revealing conversations were not with the captors, but among the prisoners themselves. They spoke of honor, of shame, of how to reconcile the image of a humane act with the larger machinery of war. Some said that accepting kindness felt like betrayal. Others said that to reject bread handed to a starving mouth would be cruelty to oneself. Both views were true in their own ways. In the end, most chose life, quietly, almost apologetically, because survival made space for other decisions later. As the weeks unfolded, small exchanges accumulated into a fuller picture. The American soldiers, medics, cooks, volunteers were not a single type. Some were young men who had been plucked from farms and factories, still learning the grammar of war and mercy. Others were older officers who insisted on discipline, but also on humane treatment. The cooks in the mess hall took pride in well-prepared bread. They would admit, with shy grin, that bread could make a person feel whole in a different way. There were instances that the women held on to as proof that humanity could persist. A birthday cake was baked for a young prisoner whose birthday fell in captivity. Candles were difficult to come by, but the small ritual was preserved. A nurse was given a thread and needle by a local volunteer, so she could mend a uniform. The act was practical but tender. Letters were written by Red Cross volunteers and passed on with care, sometimes containing news or small comforts. Language lessons began in the evenings. Some prisoners taught Japanese phrases to the guards, who reciprocated with halting English. The exchanges were clumsy at first, full of laughter and mispronunciations. Yet they chipped away at the distance between captor and captive. Arigato meant thank you across a table, and those two words then created the possibility for 100 others. Religious rituals, too, continued in quiet ways. A makeshift altar might be set up in a corner for those who wanted to pray. A rosary might be wrapped in cloth and kept like a talisman. The Americans who held the compound generally respected these practices, giving space and time when possible. That respect, simple and procedural, felt to the women like a recognition of their inner life, something that battle reports and propaganda had erased. But the human details were not only soft. There were sharp edges. News of battles, rumors of loss, the occasional harsh reprimand. These things reminded everyone that the world outside the compound was still at war. The women read newspapers passed along by Red Crossers and tried to keep track of family members. Each headline was a small stab. The bread in their mouths could not. In the end, silence, grief. Still, those small human transactions, teaching a word, passing a needle, sharing a piece of fruit, grew into a daily ledger proof that not all enemies act like the caricatures fed to a frightened imagination. For the women, each kind action was a reframing of a single simple truth that even in the apparatus of war, ordinary people could make ordinary choices to do good. When the war ended, the barbed wire fences came down one by one. For the women who had spent months behind them, freedom did not come with trumpets or tears. It came quietly, like dawn after a long rain. The gates creaked open, guards lowered their rifles, and the women stepped into a world that had changed beyond recognition. They were thinner, their uniforms faded, their hands calloused from endless chores. But they were alive. That single fact, they were alive, seemed to carry both gratitude and guilt. Around them, news drifted in like waves. Japan had surrendered. Cities lay in ashes. Families had been scattered, homes gone. Some of the women smiled when they heard. Others wept silently, not knowing whether their loved ones had survived to see this new peace. And yet, amid the ruins of nations and the collapse of empires, a small memory endured, one that had nothing to do with battles or bombs. It was a memory of a plate of food given by those they had been told to hate. As they waited for repatriation, many of the women began to speak to one another more freely. The fear of being overheard had faded. The guards were no longer enemies, just men trying to send them home. In those last weeks, the camp took on a strange, almost domestic rhythm. Cooks shared recipes. Translators helped the women write letters back to Japan. And in those letters, tucked between questions about family and news of survival, came fragments of something softer. We are treated decently. They gave us bread again today. It is not what I imagined. The shock that had once made them whisper, "I thought Americans would starve us," had transformed into quiet understanding. That moment, that meal, had become a marker in their minds, a hinge upon which their understanding of humanity turned. When the ships finally came to take them home, the women stood on deck and watched the shoreline shrink. The sea stretched vast and gray, the horizon carrying them toward a country that would not know what to make of them. They were prisoners of war, but also survivors. Some had served the empire. Others had simply been caught in its machinery. All had endured hunger, fear, and uncertainty. And yet, inside each of them lived a small, improbable story, that their captors had chosen mercy. That story became harder to tell once they returned to Japan. The people waiting on the docks were themselves starving. Whole families were living in the rubble of what had been cities. To speak of being fed by Americans, fed well, felt like betrayal or at least indecent. Some women swallowed their words. Others tried to explain, only to be met with silence or disbelief. "You must be mistaken," one neighbor said. "They are the enemy. They would never do that." So the women carried the memory quietly, like a secret folded in the corner of their hearts. They built new lives, married, raised children, took jobs in hospitals or schools. Years passed, but sometimes when the smell of baking bread drifted through an open window or when pork simmered on the stove, the memory came back. The camp, the guards, the meal, the whisper. Decades later, as historians began to collect testimonies of survivors from all sides of the war, the women were asked to tell their stories. Some refused, fearing they would not be understood. Others, now in their 70s or 80s, agreed. Their voices were soft but clear. They told of fear, of propaganda that had painted the Americans as monsters, and of the shock that followed when reality proved different. One woman said, "I remember thinking, if they are our enemies, why do they give us such food? Maybe they are not as we were told." Another recalled how she had wept over a bowl of soup, not from hunger, but from the strangeness of being cared for. It was like being told, without words, that I was still human. These testimonies reached researchers, filmmakers, and educators. They began appearing in books and documentaries, not as tales of triumph or propaganda, but as intimate portraits of moral surprise. The women's story was not about forgiveness, nor about forgetting the horrors of war. It was about the fragile, persistent power of decency. Food historians and psychologists have often noted how acts of feeding can transcend politics. To offer food is to recognize another being's right to exist. It is a primal language, older than words. When the Japanese women POWs were served pork and fresh bread, the Americans may not have intended a moral gesture. They were likely following procedure, obeying the Geneva Convention, or simply doing their duty. Yet, intention is sometimes less important than impact. For the women, that act rewrote the meaning of enemy. The bread, in their memory, became more than food. It became a symbol of contradiction. It stood for everything war tries to destroy: empathy, respect, the simple acknowledgement of another person's hunger. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Because in every conflict, no matter the era or the nation, moments like that remind us that humanity is not a national trait. It is a choice. Years later, some of those women or their children returned to the places where they had once been imprisoned. The barracks had been torn down, replaced by quiet fields or government buildings. Only fragments remained: a concrete foundation, a rusted piece of fencing, the faint outline of what had been a mess hall. One woman brought her granddaughter and pointed to the spot. "This is where I first ate American bread," she said. "It was warm. I remember thinking, it smelled like home, though it came from our enemies." The granddaughter did not understand at first. She had grown up in a peaceful Japan, surrounded by American movies, American music. For her, the idea of being shocked by kindness was hard to grasp. But as her grandmother spoke, she began to see the weight of the memory, the way it carried both gratitude and confusion for a lifetime. In time, museums and memorials began to record these stories. In one exhibit, a display case holds a photograph of women in worn uniforms sitting at a long table, heads bowed, hands folded around bowls. The caption reads, "Japanese Women POWs 1945, the first meal." Visitors stand before it, silent. The image is not dramatic. No tears, no embraces. Just people eating. Yet that quiet image tells more about humanity than many grand speeches. Historians interpret it as a turning point, a reminder that mercy can exist within the machinery of war. Military ethicists cite it when teaching about the moral responsibilities of captors. Students write essays about it, drawing parallels to modern conflicts, refugee camps, humanitarian law. Each generation finds new meaning in the story, but for the women who lived it, the meaning was always simpler. It was about fear giving way to surprise, about realizing that the world, even when divided by flags and ideologies, still contains people capable of gentleness. Now, as the last of those women pass into history, their story remains, a quiet echo against the louder noise of war. It tells us that even when nations lose their humanity, individuals can preserve it, that a single meal, served without cruelty, can challenge years of hatred, that sometimes the greatest victories in wartime happen not on battlefields, but across a table where bread is broken and shared. If you listen closely, you can still hear that whisper from the mess hall, fragile and astonished, cutting to the hum of memory. "I thought Americans would starve us." And beneath it, the rustle of a napkin, the creak of a chair, the sound of someone taking a bite of warm bread, proof, in its simplest form, that kindness once offered never truly disappears.